that microphone picks up louder than I realized, I think. In honor of Read Across America Week this week and the theme of all the places you'll go, we invited a special guest speaker to come. The title of this presentation is Theodore Roosevelt, Rough Rider President, but it might have also been titled Theodore Roosevelt, Super President, because his resume contains so many achievements. He was a Harvard graduate, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa. He was runner-up boxing champion of Harvard College. He was the youngest elected assemblyman of New York State. He was the second youngest governor of New York State. He was the youngest president in American history in 1901 at age 42. I should be president by now, don't tell anybody yet. He was the first president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the only president to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He transformed America's Navy from 26th in the world to 5th. He masterminded the Panama Canal acquisition. He was the first president to ride in an automobile. He was the first president to travel in a submarine. He was the first president to fly in an airplane. He founded a wildlife conservation club 4 years prior to the Sierra Club. He spoke fluent German, Italian, Spanish, and French. He created the Department of Labor and Commerce. He created the U.S. Forest Service and the Food and Drug Administration. He established 6 national parks and 18 national monuments. He climbed the 15,000-foot Matterhorn Mountain on his honeymoon, and he authored 40 books. In a recent poll, historians listed Franklin D. Roosevelt as the greatest president in history and Theodore Roosevelt as the second greatest. Perhaps that's true. Today, Franklin Roosevelt's likeness is on the American 10-cent piece. Theodore Roosevelt's likeness is carved in stone 6 stories tall on Mount Rushmore. Now let us meet Theodore Roosevelt as he runs for a 3rd term in the White House as the Progressive Party candidate in the 1912 presidential year. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and welcome Theodore Roosevelt.
Delighted to be here. Please take your seats. My fellow citizens, ladies and gentlemen, and take note that I say ladies because the Progressive Party is the only president's election party of 1912 that will fight for and demand a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. How can any society in good conscience grant that gemstone of American democracy the right and moral obligation to vote to an illiterate street sweeper because he's a man, then deny that gemstone to a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, or a nurse simply because she's a woman? Therefore, if you ladies will persuade your husbands, your fathers, your brothers, and your sons to vote for me in 1912, in 1916, you'll be able to go to the ballot box and vote for the candidate of your choice. Now I would like to take this opportunity to introduce myself to you for the benefit of those who have been misinformed by the lies printed about me by William Randolph Hearst in his newspaper, the New York Journal. At my home, named Sagamore Hill, in Oyster Bay, New York, we received the New York Journal, but only because my 17-year-old son, Archibald, has a pet parrot named Buster. And Buster takes particular delight in adding his comments to the editorial pages of the New York Journal, which we use to line the bottom of his cage, particularly after he's had a large lunch of peanuts. Now, first of all, the name is Theodore, not Teddy. Only one person in my life ever had my permission to call me by that nickname, and when she died at the tender age of 22, That permission was never extended to another living soul. No one in my family or my close circle of friends would dare call me Teddy. But the newspapers will not call me anything else because they know it irritates me so. The last name is Roosevelt. Not Roosevelt, but Roosevelt. When my ancestor, Klaes van Roosevelt, came over from Holland during the late 1600s, the family changed the pronunciation and the spelling to the current Roosevelt during the War of Independence. All branches of the family subscribe to that pronunciation and to that spelling. Now, with your permission, I would like to introduce my family to you by proxy. My father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. A successful New York City businessman, philanthropist, founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, and the New York Orthopedic Hospital. He was the greatest man I ever knew, and his nickname was Great Heart. My mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, a Southern belle raised upon a slave-owning Georgia plantation who once declared that the Civil War was not officially over until she surrendered, and she never did. One New York newspaper once described her as the most beautiful woman in New York City. My older sister, Anna Roosevelt. My older sister and lifelong best friend. Her nickname was Bammy, short for the Italian Bambina, which means young girl. My younger brother, Elliot Roosevelt. Considered by the family the most intellectually gifted, most athletically capable, and voted by the family most likely to succeed. However, in later years, his sole claim to fame would be that he was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt. My younger sister, Corinne Roosevelt. My younger sister and also lifelong best friend. She was grown up to be a talented author and later grandmother to those two famed journalists, Joseph and Stuart Alsop. But the best thing that my younger sister ever did for me was to introduce me to her childhood playmate, Edith Kermit Thoreau. Now, Edith Kermit Thoreau was not a member of the Roosevelt family, but she was in all of the family portraits because she was inseparable from my younger sister, Corinne. And as of last December, Edith and I have been husband and wife for 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Roosevelt family by proxy. I was born on October 27th, 1858 in New York City. As a child, I was severely afflicted by asthma. So severely, I had to sleep sitting up in a chair or propped up in my bed with 4 pillows behind my back. Many a night, I had not sufficient breath to blow out the bedside candle. My family physician predicted that I would not live to reach my 7th birthday. Because I was a semi-invalid, I could not attend public school. I was homeschooled by my Aunt Anna, my mother's sister, who gave me the basics of education by teaching me reading, writing, and that third discipline I could never quite get my arms around. But reading opened a whole new world for me. My father had a modest library, and while my neighborhood chums were amusing themselves by rolling hoops down 20th Street, I was in my father's library, sailing around the Horn with Magellan, exploring the western rivers with Lewis and Clark, and conquering Persia with Alexander the Great. One book that I found particularly fascinating was a book on taxidermy. I read it from cover to cover twice, and I mastered the art and the skills. When my neighborhood chums would try to impress their neighborhood sweethearts by presenting them with a bouquet of flowers, I would win the day by reaching into my pocket and pulling out a perfectly preserved dead bat.
I didn't even see that bat.
One day, after a particularly bad bout of asthma, my father, Greatheart, took me aside and said, "Teedy," which was my nickname growing up, "a man needs 3 things in this world to succeed: decisive judgment, bold action, and courage of perseverance. Your intellect will give you decisive judgment. Your body must give you bold action. Together, they will give you courage of perseverance. You must build your body." I raised my hand and I swore to him, "I will, Father. I will build my body." I started a regimen of running 25 miles every day, rain or shine, summer or winter, or rowing 25 miles in the East River in my little one-man rowboat. An upstairs bedroom was transformed in my personal gymnasium, outfitted with barbells, Indian clubs, a chin-up bar, and a punching bag. My father even hired a professional prize fighter to teach me the manly art of pugilistics. In 1876, when the United States Army was proving its ineptitude at fighting Indians by the debacle at Little Bighorn and General George Armstrong Custer, I was proving my aptitude for higher education by passing the entrance examinations to Harvard College. I started Harvard that fall, and back then I was known as that skinny New York City kid, where I only weighed 124 pounds, who excelled in foreign languages, history, science, and was captain of the rowing team and the boxing team. During my summers off, I would go with a classmate whose father owned a timber camp in northern Maine. I would become a lumberjack for the summer. I learned to use a double-bitted axe, a 2-man crosscut saw, and on my days off, I would climb every high mountain within a 25-mile radius of the camp. In 1878, while I was attending Harvard, a Western Union messenger appeared at the classroom door. It was a telegram from my younger brother Elliot. It said, "Teedy, come home at once. Greatheart is dying." I excused myself from the classroom. I ran from Cambridge down to the train depot in Boston, caught the first train to New York City, ran down the street to my home to be met at the front door by my younger brother Elliot, who said, "Greatheart is gone." He was 46 years old. I attended his funeral on February 12th. By coincidence, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Curious about that date. You see, when my brother Elliot and I were aged 6 and 4.5, we watched from my uncle's upstairs apartment window as the casket of slain President Abraham Lincoln was paraded down Fifth Avenue. And ever since that day, I've always associated the name of Lincoln and his birthday, February 12th, with death. And now, my father was being buried on February 12th. I raised my hand and I swore, I will make my father's name, Theodore Roosevelt, known throughout the world. I returned to class, and then during the winter of 1879, 1880, I was invited to the home of a classmate northeast of Boston, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. There, I met his next-door neighbor. Her name was Alice Hathaway Lee, the most strikingly beautiful young lady I had ever seen in my life. I made an entry in my journal that very evening that someday she shall be Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. Decisive judgment. I posed the question, Miss Lee, will you marry me? She said no. Courage of perseverance. 1 month later, I posed the question again, Miss Lee, will you please marry me? She said no. Bold action. I purchased an engagement ring at a jewelry store. I rented a rig at a livery stable, pulled by a handsome pony. I took her to an orchestra concert in Boston, and on our way home, I jumped down out of the rig, presented her with the ring, and said, Miss Lee, say that you'll make me the happiest man in America by becoming Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. She said yes. She said we can announce our engagement on February 12th, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. I said, no, let us delay it for 2 days and announce it on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. That would be much more romantic. That is what we did. Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Hathaway Lee. As graduation was approaching, I went back to the family physician, the same one who predicted that I would not live to reach my 7th birthday, for a checkup. He said, Mr. Roosevelt, all of those years of asthma have affected your heart and your lungs. When you graduate from Harvard, you must pursue a career that has no physical activity associated with it whatsoever. Any strenuous physical activity on your part would be instantly fatal. I made up my mind to do exactly the opposite of what my doctor had prescribed. I kept up with my running, my rowing. In my senior year, I was runner-up boxing champion of Harvard College. I graduated magna cum laude. Phi Beta Kappa, number 26 out of a class of 137. I might have graduated first had it not been for calculus and trigonometry. Following graduation, Alice Hathaway Lee and I were married on my 22nd birthday on October 27th, 1880. Why, you might ask, would a gentleman schedule his wedding day to coincide with his birthday? It was that mathematics thing. I thought that might be the only way that I'd be able to remember my anniversary. After a short 3-month honeymoon in Europe, where I climbed the Matterhorn mountain, we were sailing back to America when my wife turned to me and said, Teddy, the only person in my life given my permission to call me by that nickname, what do you plan to do with the rest of your life? I said, I am going to be a lawyer. I have enrolled in Columbia Law School. But it soon became apparent to myself, my classmates, and my professors that I would never become a lawyer. I remember standing up in class one day and arguing against the injustice of precedent law when my professor said, Mr. Roosevelt, would you prefer that I left the classroom so that you may teach this course of instruction without my constant interruption? I terminated my law school career at the end of the next week, and I was simultaneously asked by the Republican Party of New York State if I'd be willing to campaign to be the assemblyman from my district. I said, bully! I campaigned from east to west, from north to south, and mostly with the help of my father's good name and with the help of my father's financial friends, I was elected the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York. I strolled into the Capitol building in Albany. Heads turned, and they said, who is that young dude? A new page? They said, no, that is the young Theodore Roosevelt. He is the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York. The problem of being the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York is that in order to introduce a bill, you must be recognized and asked to speak by the Speaker of the Assembly. It was the same Speaker of the Assembly who was Speaker when I was born. I would raise my hand and say, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker! For 40 minutes if necessary until I was recognized, I would introduce my bill, and in my first year in the Assembly, I introduced and passed more bills than any other member of the Assembly, regardless of their age or seniority. After re-election to the Assembly, I was introducing a bill when a Western Union messenger appeared at the door. It was a telegram from my older sister, Bammy. It said, "Teeny, congratulations, your wife Alice has delivered a beautiful baby girl named Alice Lee Roosevelt on February 12th, 1884. I thanked the young man. I continued to argue my bill, and then within the hour, a second messenger appeared with a second telegram from my sister Bammy. It said, "Teeny, come home at once. Mother is dying, and so is your wife." I excused myself from the Assembly. I ran down to the train depot in Albany, but I'd missed the train to New York City. I had to wait around for 2 hours for the next train. I got into New York City about midnight. The city was enshrouded in a thick fog. I ran from gas lamp to gas lamp along the street till I arrived at my home to be met at the front door by my older sister, Bammy, who said, "Mother has been diagnosed with typhoid fever, and the doctors say she will not live through the night. And your wife, Alice, has been diagnosed with Bright's disease, a disease of the kidneys, which was masked by her pregnancy. She is upstairs in your bedroom in a coma." I bounded up the stairs. I rushed into my room. I held my wife's hand. I spoke to her. She did not even realize that I was in the room. I whispered in her ear. I tried to comfort her. I stroked her hair until a knock at the door, a signal from my sister Bammy that if I wanted to see my mother alive, I needed to come downstairs now. I went down the main stairway into the master bedroom where I held my mother's cool, limp hand until the flame from her candle of life flickered and grew dark. She was 48 years old. I went back upstairs to comfort my wife, and 13 hours later, on that same day, in that same house, my 22-year-old wife's flame flickered and grew dark, extinguishing all the light from my soul. Both of the women I love so dearly, taken from me on that same day, February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. I attended the double funeral on February 16th, and I was comforted by my childhood friend, Edith Kermit Carew, who was dressed in black, her face streaming with tears, who held my arm. After the service, she said, "Theodore, if there's anything I can do for you, you let me know." I said, "Thank you, Edith, but my older sister Bammy has agreed to raise my daughter as if she were her very own, and I will provide all the funds necessary. But I do appreciate your generous offer." I went back to the house, and I went through all of my journals. Any page in my journal that bore my wife's name, I tore that page from the journal, crumpled it up, and threw it into the fireplace. I likewise went around to all the photographs on the wall. Any photograph of my wife, I tore that from the frame, crumpled it up, and threw that into the fireplace. My friends thought this was very harsh of me. But I've always held the philosophy that grief can be an anvil that sits upon the shoulders of the grieving. There is nothing that can be done about the past. The future is for the living. I went back to the assembly, I finished out my term, and then I was asked by a colleague if I'd like to go on a bison hunting trip to the Dakota Territories. I said, bully, just the thing to take my mind off my past family tragedies. I had been hunting with my younger brother Elliot in Nebraska, in Iowa, and in Minnesota, and in the corner of the Dakota Territories, but I'd always wanted to penetrate deeper into the Dakotas to see what it was like. This was an opportunity. I boarded a train. I passed through Bismarck, another 140 miles to the west, to the small village of Medora. There I stepped off the train onto the platform, and I looked around, and I was struck with the beauty of this 360-degree prairie landscape. A prairie that had nourished the bodies of 40 to 60 million American bison for 10,000 years. And now the bison had been hunted to almost extermination, and the prairie grass that had nurtured their bodies was growing shoulder high. I thought to myself, what a magnificent land for a cattle ranch. I made some inquiries, and I purchased the Elkhorn Ranch on the banks of the Little Missouri River, a tributary of the Missouri River. I became a rancher. I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, have 2 cups of coffee, 2 biscuits, 2 eggs, 2 slabs of bacon, and then I would go out into the corral. I would saddle up a wild bronc, put my foot in the stirrup, throw my leg across, to be thrown to the ground repeatedly. Whump, crash, thud, whop, roller, 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 roller. Each time I would get back up, brush myself off, retrieve my spectacles and my hat, put my foot back in the stirrup, throw my leg across, until by the end of the day, I was riding that wild bronc like it was a carousel pony. It was not unheard of for me to be in the saddle for 23 hours, non-stop, without my feet ever touching the ground. One time, after 17 hours in the saddle, chasing down some runaway horses, I happened upon the small Montana Territory village of Mingusville. Now, Mingusville had a general store, a post office, a hotel, and a saloon. There was only one building in the town, but it housed all 4 of those enterprises. I tied up my horse at the hitching rack. I started to make my entrance when 2 gunshots rang out. Bam! Bam! I thought this was very curious, but I continued with my entrance, and when I stepped inside, I was immediately confronted by a drunken, dirty cowboy with a pistol in each hand. And I looked up on the wall, and the clock on the wall had 2 bullet holes in it. And upon my arrival, the cowboy blurted out, "Look, boys, Far Eyes is going to buy the house a round of drinks." One thing I discovered immediately upon my sojourn to the West was that anyone who wore spectacles, it was somehow considered to be a besmirchment to their character. And many times I had to brush aside comments from my cowboys about my spectacles with a smile. This was no exception. I smiled, I went over and I took a seat by the pot-bellied stove. But the cowboy would not desist. He came up behind my chair, he cocked a pistol in each hand, click, click. He bent over and repeated his demand. I said Far Eyes was going to buy the house a round of drinks. He did not realize he was standing behind the runner-up boxing champion of Harvard College. I slowly rose to my feet, spun on my toes, and connected the point of his chin with a right cross. Bam! Which snapped his head 90 degrees to the left. I countered with a left cross. Wham! Which snapped his head 180 degrees to the right. He keeled over backwards, discharged both pistols in the air, bam, bam! Hit his head on the edge of the bar, and fell unconscious to the floor. The fellow patrons disarmed him, and drug him by his dirty cowboy boots out the front door and around back where they locked him in a woodshed for the night. The following morning, as I understand it, he was rearmed. He jumped aboard a boxcar on a freight train headed west and was never seen in Mingus again. The only reason that I tell you this story is so that you may know the full truth of the matter. It never ceased to amuse me the many humorous distortions that were printed in the newspapers of the West. I remember one Wyoming Territory newspaper printed, Theodore Roosevelt, that young dude rancher from New York City, was intoxicated again in Mingus when a passing Mormon family asked him for directions. Mr. Roosevelt, being too intoxicated to understand the question, turned and started to walk away, at which time the Mormon gentleman tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What are those peculiar little windows you have perched on your nose?" At which time Mr. Roosevelt produced a 6-shooter revolver, bam! Shot the man graveyard dead, and drug his body over onto the railroad tracks to make it look like an accident. If William Randolph Hearst would have had a reporter in the vicinity, it would have been a naked Theodore Roosevelt rode bareback on a grizzly bear into a Catholic girls' school where he ravished all of the nuns and sold all of the girls into white slavery. In 1886, personal family business required my return to New York City. I went to the home of my younger sister, Coney, and who should be visiting but my childhood playmate, Edith Kermit Carew. Her face flushed with the blush of womanhood, descending the stairs in a long flowing gown, looking more radiantly beautiful than any vision I'd ever seen in my life. New York City society taboos prevented a widower from dating within 3 years of his wife's death, so we met secretly, and soon I posed the question, "Edith, will you marry me?" She said, "Theodore, I've waited all of my life for you to ask that question." Of course. We made secret plans to sail separately to England. No advertisement was put in any newspaper. She sailed the week before I did. I sailed the day after my birthday, October 28th, 1886. I shall never forget that day because there was a big commotion in New York Harbor. It seems that the people of France had given a large copper lighthouse to the people of America to commemorate our independence. And now the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, was on hand to receive this gift on behalf of a grateful nation. And there were so many people crowded on that small little Bedloe Island, I was fearful that the island might capsize, statue and all, and sink into the ocean. But because it was the day after my birthday, I've always thought that the Statue of Liberty was a personal gift to me. I sailed across the Atlantic. I met up with Edith. We were married in a small chapel service. And then after a short 11-week honeymoon in Europe, we were sailing back to America. At which time she turned to me and said, "Theodore, what do you plan to do with the rest of your life?" I said, "I am going to be a rancher." But upon arrival in New York Harbor, I found that a telegram had been waiting for me from my ranch foreman, Bill Sewell. It said, "Mr. Roosevelt, worst blizzard in Dakota history. Herd devastated. Request you come immediately and inspect." I kissed my new bride goodbye. I boarded the train. This time when I stepped off the train at the platform in Medora, I looked around at this 360-degree prairie landscape and saw that it was dotted with little black dots. It was like the land had measles or smallpox. It was dead cattle. Dead cattle so numerous a person could walk 360 degrees around the horizon by stepping from dead carcass to dead carcass. I was picked up at the train station by my foreman, Bill Sewell. I said, Bill, how bad is it? He said, Mr. Roosevelt, of your 4,500 head of cattle, only 80 survive. And they are dying daily. I went back to the ranch. I saddled up a horse. I made a quick inspection to her. I saw the situation was hopeless. I went back to the ranch. I signed over the deed to my foreman, wished him good luck and farewell. I went back to New York City. Within the week, I was approached by the Republican Party of New York State to see if I'd be willing to go on the campaign trail to campaign on behalf of their presidential nominee, General Benjamin Harrison, a hero of the Civil War. I said, gentlemen, it's true that I do need a source of income because I've suffered some financial losses with my cattle business, but why do you need me to campaign for a Civil War hero like Benjamin Harrison? They say Benjamin Harrison is a nice man, a pleasant man, but have you no idea how famous you have become from the books you've read, you've written about cowboy life, about ranch life, about hunting in the Rocky Mountains, and those newspaper accounts of how you handled the Mingersville bully. We need someone with your manly ranch Western image to campaign in the West for him. I said, why can't Benjamin Harrison campaign in the West himself? They said, Benjamin Harrison has a Midas handshake. I said, I do not get your meaning. He said, he can shake a lifelong Republican's hand with his cold, limp handshake and transform them into a golden Democrat. That's why we need you with your manly ranch image to campaign on his behalf in the Western states. I said, bully! I caught a train, crossed back west of the Mississippi River. I campaigned through Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and General Benjamin Harrison was elected President of the United States. And as my reward, he made me Federal Civil Service Commissioner. I completely cleaned up the Federal Civil Service Commission. I routed out greed, graft, corruption, bribery, party politics. I instilled a new device called the written examination system, where every candidate would have to take a written examination so it could be compared on a competitive basis with every other candidate for that civil service job. And then when Grover Cleveland was re-elected president, he asked me to stay on as his Federal Civil Service Commissioner. But it was most difficult for me to stay on in Washington, D.C., when I just built a new house called Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, New York, on my salary of $350 per month. So when I received a telegram from the mayor of New York, if I'd be willing to take an appointment as commissioner of the New York City Police Department, I said, bully! I tendered my resignation to Grover Cleveland. I caught a train for New York City, and I discovered at this time in history that New York City had two notorious gangs of criminals operating within the city. The first gang consisted of murderers, kidnappers, arsonists, thugs, extortionists, and owners of houses of ill repute and houses of gambling. That gang was known as the New York City Police Department. The second gang were just common criminals who lived down by the waterfront. I fired the chief of police, most of his lieutenants. I instilled a written examination system to become a patrolman on the police force. I reorganized the department on the orders of a military organization, and I established the second police training academy in the entire United States. Then the Republican Party of New York State approached me again to see if I'd be willing to go on the campaign trail for their new presidential hopeful, Governor William McKinley of Ohio. I said, bully. I campaigned in the old states west of the Mississippi, but during the Harrison administration, new states had been added. In 1889, we added South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and then in 1890, we added Wyoming. I campaigned in those new states along with the old states, and Governor William McKinley was elected president over that preacher politician from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. And as my reward, he made me Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I knew more about the United States Navy than any other man in Washington, except for the top admirals. See, during my senior year at Harvard, I'd written a 2-volume book called The Naval War of 1812, pointing out all the mistakes and all the things that were done correctly in that war. That 2-volume treatise has now become required reading at West Point, the Naval Academy, and required placement in every commissioned United States Navy ship. I read my job description as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, paragraph 1. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, you will assist the Secretary of the Navy in all duties and tasks assigned. Paragraph 2. In the absence of the Secretary of the Navy, you will perform all duties of the Secretary of the Navy. I persuaded the Secretary of the Navy to be absent a great deal. And in his absence, I managed to lobby Congress for better warships, better training for the men, better armament, and more dry docks to repair the ships in the fleet. And then the date on the calendar wall was approaching February 12th, 1898, the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, the day that I had buried my father in 1878. I crossed my fingers, I prayed, nothing happened. I tore that page from the calendar wall to see that February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, was approaching. The day when I lost my mother and my 22-year-old wife 13 hours apart. I crossed my fingers, I prayed, nothing happened. I tore that page from the calendar to reveal February 15th, 1898. A knock on the door from Western Union presented me with a telegram marked urgent. It says, the battleship USS Maine has been blown up in Havana Harbor. Spanish sabotage is suspected. War imminent. I turned in my resignation as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to President McKinley. I went to the Secretary of War and begged him for an officer position in a cavalry unit. He said, Mr. Roosevelt, the current total strength of the United States Army is only 22,000 men. We have no vacancy in any cavalry unit to put you into. I said, how would you like to have a new cavalry regiment? He said, well, that would be magnificent, but how would you manage that? I said, leave it to me. I put ads in all the newspapers of the West, in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, Texas, Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Wyoming, Montana. Wanted brave young men who are crack shots and skilled riders to serve in a volunteer cavalry regiment under the leadership of Colonel Leonard Wood, Medal of Honor winner in the Indian War, and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy and former Police Commissioner of New York City. 26,000 applications poured in. I was only allowed to select 1,500 men. I selected 1,450, and then I went back to the Ivy League colleges, and I handpicked 50 top leaders from the Ivy League and incorporated them into the unit. We started training in San Antonio, Texas, and the newspapers nicknamed our outfit Teddy's Tarantulas. I explained to them that I did not liked that nickname, and so they changed it to Roosevelt's Rough Riders, in deference to Colonel Wild Bill Cody, Congress of Rough Riders and Wild West Show. After 2 months, we received a telegram saying, transport your unit to Tampa for further shipment to Cuba to fight the Spanish. But there was only room on the trains for the horses, for the officers, and only 900 of the 1,500 Rough Riders. We had to leave 600 men back to continue their training in San Antonio. We boarded the train, went to Tampa. We loaded onto troop ships. We sailed for the south coast of Cuba. And the situation was like this. Santiago, the city that was the capital for the Spanish, represented by my hat. In front of it was a harbor to the Caribbean Sea. In that harbor was 9 Spanish warships. The harbor narrow entrance was guarded by 2 large caliber naval guns. The United States Navy could not get into the harbor, and if the Spanish Navy tried to get out, they would be immediately blown out of the water by the awaiting Second Fleet. Therefore, the situation was a stalemate unless a ridge of mountains behind Santiago called San Juan Heights could be captured by the Army. On July 5th, 1898, which was coincidentally the 35th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, we were given the assignment to attack the right flank of that ridge. But the regular Army commander of the 4th Infantry Regiment fell ill to yellow fever. Leonard Wood was promoted to Brigadier General. I was promoted to full colonel and given command of the Rough Riders. I looked my men in the eye and I said, gentlemen, the just cause is on our side. Gentlemen, for the pride of your country, charge! And I, astride my horse, Little Texas, leaping over barbed wire entanglements, leaping over firing trenches, led my Rough Riders afoot onto the top of the hill. Upon arrival at the top of the hill, a Spanish sniper jumped from a trench with a Mauser rifle pointing at me. I lowered my Navy Colt double-action 38 caliber pistol, bam, and dispatched him like a jackrabbit. I dismounted from my worn-out steed. I rallied the Rough Riders. Follow me, men! We charged down a saddle and up onto San Juan Heights, where the Spanish flag of surrender appeared from the trenches. The war was over in 90 days. When we sailed back to New York City, I discovered that the newspaper accounts of my single-handed attack on San Juan Heights had made me the most famous man in America. The Republican Party of New York State approached me and said, we have an impossible task. We have a popular Democratic governor in the governor's mansion, and we have no Republican challenger who can run against him in the upcoming 1900 election and unseat